Hello and welcome to the Next to the Jewish Ethics Project's podcast. Delighted to be here today with Dan Neidle and Daniel Greenberg, CB. Dan, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Dan Neidle. I was a tax lawyer for many years. I then retired to set up a micro think tank, Tax Policy Associates. We think and write about tax policy. We investigate tax avoidance. We generally make mischief.
That's a deliberately understated introduction, Dan. We'll come back towards the end of the podcast and press you a little bit more on some of what I might describe as your activism and the important work that you do. But we'll come back to that if we may.
Oh, I would deny being an activist.
That's fine. You can deny that later. We'll come back to that. We can discuss what activism means. Well, let me open up. The general title is Ethics of Taxation, and it fits into our general theme in the Jewish Ethics Project of trying to look at the ethics of different aspects of the world, and tax being a rather ever-present and important aspect of the world. We want to think about ethics of it, and I want to do it in 4 chunks. I want to start by asking ourselves, what, if anything, are the ethical underpinnings of tax? And I'll explain what the question means in a moment. Then I want to see what that implies, what our conclusions are, if any, about whether there is an ethical underpinning, what it is, what that implies about our approach to tax. I want to talk about tax law. I want to talk about evasion and avoidance. I want to talk about the elusive spirit of the law. And that will be our second focus. And then I want to rather uncomfortably bring us on the back of that to look at the rather uncomfortable issue of the relationship between religious people and taxation, and in particular Orthodox Jews and a reputation for their relationship with taxation, which will be a slightly uncomfortable part of the discussion, but needs to be had. And then finally, as I said, Dan, I want to focus a little bit on your motivation for, and again, the ethical underpinnings of the work, whether it's activism or not is neither here nor there, but the work that you as a tax lawyer for many years, what's motivated you, and what underpins the approach that you've taken, sometimes quite controversially, by which I mean you've upset some people, in some cases people who definitely should have been upset. They needed to be upset, and we might come and look at that at the end. So, taking us back to the beginning, first question, Dan, is there a single ethical underpinning to taxation policy in, let's look at the United Kingdom, but I'm very interested to hear about other examples that you know about around the world. And in particular, is there an ineluctably redistributive aspect? Is taxation necessarily socialist in nature? Is it actually nothing to do with socialism? Is it a simple shared services concept? You know, in Jewish law, tax first comes in sharing payments for the temple, and then in a power for the king. Once government expands, taxation expands. Well, we know about that. Tax law starts with the Ways and Means formula. Oh, noble sovereign, please do this, and we'll pay you to do it. So, is it redistributive? Is it purely shared services? Or is it enforced charity? Is it compulsory tzedakah? So, Dan, how do you see the underpinnings? Or maybe there's another, maybe you deny that those are present, maybe there's something else that's present, or maybe you think there's nothing that's present. How do you see the ethical underpinnings of taxation?
This is, I think, certainly the first Jewish podcast I've participated in. So probably I have to answer a question with a question, don't I? Isn't that required?
Yeah. That's expected, yeah.
What do you mean by ethical?
I mean value. What values, if any, are driving the policy or justifying the policy? So socialism has values within it. Capitalism has values within it, like simply equity, if I'm benefiting from a service, then there is a social contract that requires me to pay my part of that service. So, what values are, if any, are either driving or justifying the policy of taxation?
Hmm. I guess another traditional answer would for me to give you two contradictory answers. My
Yeah,
first answer is none. Tax policy is a mess. It's a mess of conflicting aims, incoherent application, and taxpayer responses. And put it all together, look at it, and lots of it is irrational and has no particular purpose or meaning behind it. My second answer is let's look the other way. Whenever one writes about tax online or in a newspaper, there is someone who will reply and say tax is theft, that tax
yeah,
is essentially illegitimate. And
yeah.
when I'm the occasionally I make the mistake of replying. And when I reply, uh, I say something like, hang on a second. How old is civilization? Civilization is what, 4,000 years old, 5,000 years old? The story of civilization is the story of tax. Civilization could not exist without tax. And yes, early tax was merely a strong guy with hard and sharp objects, extracting money from people who were fewer and or had less hard and less sharp objects. But nevertheless, that is how civilization came to be. Tax avoidance is also as old as civilization. We have a tablet from the 19th century BCE which describes a trader called Pashukan, and he'd been imprisoned for receiving goods on which the duty hadn't been paid, receiving smuggling goods. So that's the first historical evidence of tax evasion, round about the time of the first historical evidence of civilization, 19th century Sumeria. So tax is necessary for civilization. I think that's kind of obvious. And if you believe that civilization is a good thing, and I will controversially say that I do, then that means it has to follow that tax is a good thing. And ultimately, that suffices as an ethical justification for tax. Is tax then necessarily progressive? Well, to some extent, it has to be, because you cannot extract tax from people without money. And yes, it's a lot easier to extract tax from people with money. In biblical days, tax was on property essentially. It was on crops. It was on livestock. It was on land. And if you had none of those things, you didn't pay tax. Did that mean they were in a socialist nirvana? No, no, not really. But the boundary between progressive tax as a political ideal and progressive tax simply as a necessity of any functioning tax system is kind of wobbly. None of which I think answers your question. So I think I'm doing well in the Talmudic stakes.
The two bits that no, it's that's all very helpful. There are two bits I want. Well, there's one bit I want to press you on, and there's one bit I want to expand on. I mean, the taxes theft idea, of course, gets some in United Kingdom law. It gets um, some support really from the Bill of Rights, which has a which has a continued practical application. When I used to do finance bills, when I was parliamentary counsellor, I used to write the finance bills. Some years I used to do the finance bill, and of course you have to remember to continue income tax, because if you forget to put that vital little because and under the Bill of Rights, income tax is an annual tax. And the reason why that's relevant to taxes theft as a notion is it requires to be justified afresh each year. The idea that there's a permanent burden of tax is actually contrary to the concept of annualization in income tax, that the Treasury has to justify it every year. Now, after the First World War, there was this idea, well, we might not need income tax every year. Of course, in fact, we do need income tax every year, and ironically, it was super tax was introduced shortly after the First World War, wasn't it? So it's the reverse. But in principle, the idea is the king has to justify what battles he wants to wage against Spain or whatever it is, or whatever he wants to do. And the government has to justify what it wants to do before it can demand a contribution from me. Now, that's an ethical justification, I think, isn't it, of a non-redistributive nature?
Yes, I mean, the significance of the Bill of Rights was that until then, the king had been able to collect tax on a whim. And the Bill of Rights said no, Parliament collects it. And that was an enormous
Well,
change.
Parliament grants it.
Parliament
Parliament
grants
doesn't.
it, yes.
Yeah,
Thank you, yes, absolutely correct. That is really the moment at which parliamentary supremacy started, because
yeah,
he who controls the collection of tax controls the state,
absolutely.
broadly speaking.
Yeah,
So that, first of all, the change was who had the power, but the second change is that it means that tax becomes a legal thing. It takes it a step away from large men simply turning up demanding money.
yeah, yeah,
Once it becomes a legal matter, then suddenly you are giving a degree of power to the poor taxpayers who have the ability to look at it and say, well, no, I don't think this tax is quite due. And that's how we ended up with the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act, an eccentric guy called Thomas Bowles, Thomas Gibson Bowles, said that in fact there was a problem, that there was a gap between the House of Commons budget resolution, back then it was normally in April after the budget in March, and the Finance Act receiving royal assent in June or
yeah.
July. And during that gap, there was no income tax, and everyone collected it, basically a kind of gentleman's agreement. And
Yeah,
Bowles said, well, no, you can't. And he sued the Bank of England,
that's
and he won.
yeah, yeah.
And as a result of that, we have the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act, which has been renewed several times since. I think originally it was 1913, and
And
that.
has been very controversial recently, as you know, in connection with parliamentary sovereignty. There is indeed ongoing litigation, which therefore we won't discuss. But it is this is not a matter of ancient history.
Oh, what's that litigation? I may have missed that.
Well, in very broad terms, the issue is whether challenging the effect of the 1967 Provisional Collection of Tax Act. For viewers, I should say that's a provision that takes parliamentary resolutions when the Chancellor gives the budget speech. At the moment when she or he stands up and moves a resolution that will eventually end up in an act of parliament, the resolution immediately has provisional effect, and that's how petrol prices go up at once and beer prices go up at once and so on and so forth. And the question is, if you challenge that, are you in fact challenging parliamentary activity, which is contrary to Article 9 of the Bill of Rights, right? Or are you challenging legislation, which, as you say, is inherently permissible in terms of the rule of law. I want to come back to the rule of law later, but the bit I wanted to press you on, which you've now repeated, Dan, was you said civilization. The story of civilization is a story of tax, which I like, but then you immediately gave a strange picture of that, because you talked about a sort of a strong man standing across the way in a trading route in ancient Mesopotamia and demanding some of your silk or whatever it is. But to me, that's a strange picture of civilization. To me, that's a picture of the opposite of civilization. That's a picture of barbarism.
But I think, and I'm in danger of going way outside my wheelhouse here, but civilization arose from barbarism because it was the large men with clubs demanding money to sustain them without working, which eventually became settlements, which eventually became civilization. I suspect the start of it was rather brutal, even if the end point was rather more
Well, I
constitutional.
really like that analysis. I mean, I'm even less well placed than you, or much less well placed than you, to judge the historical the historical accuracy of it, but I certainly like that as a human explanation. And I think then that begins to suggest that we are answering our question, or at least beginning to answer our question, because on that basis, it's about fairness. On that basis, it's about, yes, it's reasonable, it is fair to expect me to pay, for example, for the maintenance of the road that I'm using to walk backwards and forwards along in moving my silk around
Hmm.
Mesopotamia, or whatever it is. But it's not fair just to grab a bit of it along the way because you can and then go off and buy Mars bars with it. So, would you accept that on your analysis there is at least a concept of fair shares, fairness, rather than socialist redistribution or enforced tzedakah?
I tend not to like the F word because people in a tax context use fair to mean in accordance with my own views of how things should work. So I'm a little reluctant to say fair, but I think it is. I think it must be right that everyone contributes tax for a civilization that they benefit from. And yes, the philosophers then start worrying about, well, of course, you didn't individually agree to
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
a
The social
social
contract.
contract
Yeah,
obviously is
yeah,
not an actual contract. I certainly didn't
yeah,
sign anything. So
yeah,
that does enable some people, be they eccentrics on Twitter or sovereign citizens, to say,
yeah.
but yeah, this doesn't bind me. I never agreed to it. Back in the real world, no civilization can work like that. So the existence of tax, I think, unless you are 12 years old, the existence of tax is fair and necessary as a price of civilization. The next question is, how should it work?
Yeah, but let's make a bridge between those two questions by pushing you. Would you accept? I'm sorry to be tedious about this, but would you, if you don't like fair, and I see why you don't, would you accept that based on your idea of barbarism moving to civilization, the point at which it becomes civilization is the point at which it stops being unfair? Because it's not simply I'm grabbing it off you because I'm bigger than you. It becomes, which is unfair on any analysis, it becomes less unfair because there is and I'm moving towards rule of law, which I suspect you and I
Hmm.
both prefer to social contract, being lawyers and not moral philosophers. But I'm moving towards that. It becomes less unfair because I can at least show you the justification for both the collecting and, we're coming on to this more in a moment, the spending of tax.
Yes, I guess there's several levels of, forgive me for using the word fairness here. The
Yeah.
first is large man with club demands money. The Romans pile in and demand that everyone now pays them tax, first level. Second level, you have rules written down. And maybe it's the tithes, maybe it's from Leviticus. You can't change those rules, obviously, but nevertheless, there are rules written down. You know how they work. You know what is and isn't taxed. People get to argue about exactly how the rules work, and that is more fair than man with club. Then the next level is, well, you have a democracy, and the taxes that we have are the taxes that we as a society collectively deserve because we've agreed on them. Now, if you are someone who doesn't like the tax system and you disagree with everyone, that might be cold comfort, but it's nevertheless a fairer outcome than either man with club or tablets of stone.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to summarize the first chunk of our discussion. I'm going to summarize it by using the word you started with, which I think we've just demonstrated pretty much sums up where we are today. You said it's a muddle, and I think we've sort of ended up slightly showing that because if you talk to people today about what the appearance, certainly in the United Kingdom, of tax policy is, they will certainly say it's nothing like as simple as you and I have just said. There is no suggestion that it is simply a fair charge for implicitly socially contracted services. The truth is, in UK tax today, there is an element of redistribution of wealth. There just is, because much of my tax burden goes to, whether it's funding the social security system, in addition to national insurance, it goes to funding money for people who haven't got money. There is therefore an element of enforced tzedakah in it. And one of the, sometimes people say, I don't mind paying for all sorts of things that are done with my tax money, but I'd quite like a choice. You mentioned tithes, Dan, and that's a very good example, because in the traditional the traditional Jewish value element of this, actually, we don't like to institutionalize tzedakah. Tzedakah should continue to be something I feel that I give. It should be an impulse from me. And if you grab it from me and give it to someone else, you may be being fair in redistributive terms, but you're actually denying me the opportunity to make a valued ethical choice about whom I want to subsidize, who I want to help. So there's that aspect of it. Then there is a shared services aspect, and finally there is there is a socialist capitalist balance that shifts according to the nature of the government from time to time and comes out in certain elements of tax policy. So can we agree that there are a number of different potential ethical value-driven justifications for tax, and that at the moment in the UK, nobody clearly knows which they are relying on, to what extent and why. And therefore, as you said at the beginning, it's a bit of a muddle.
Yes. I mean, one could imagine a society where tax was significantly less and tzedakah was significantly more common. And
Yeah.
the very wealthy would pay a lot less tax than here, maybe sort of half as much on average, but would feel under social pressure and, or from the goodness of their hearts, would make large charitable donations. In fact, we don't need to imagine it. That country exists. It's called the United States. And we see that the result of that is that you have many more museums, ballets, hospital wings.
Hospitals?
Yes, hospital wings with brass plates saying built by David Greenberg. But you have significantly less social amenities in deprived areas. If you leave it to tzedakah, then you end up with public services that reflect the preferences, the biases, the beliefs, the lives of the people giving tzedakah. And I think that's a suboptimal result.
I don't disagree with that at all. And I think what we're looking at here is it's suboptimal at a national or institutional level. What I'm doing is reminding us that, or reminding myself really, that there is a spiritual component of the desire to give, to help people, the desire to choose to use my money to help others, that is taken from me if the strong man, now called the commissioners for revenue and customs, just takes it from me and hands it out. It's depriving me of the ability to do a good thing.
Um, Kind of, although given charity is tax deductible, kind of not.
Yeah,
You have the
yeah,
ability, instead of paying £100 of tax, you have the ability to make a £200 donation and make the £100 of tax go away. Of course, it's then a bit more expensive for you, but
yeah.
to a
That's
degree
so.
you can do
But I
that.
mean, sorry, Dan, fill us in. A basic rate taxpayer does not have the choice completely, because they don't get complete tax relief, do they?
Uh, well, the charity gets the relief.
Yeah.
So
So I'm not.
economically,
So
it's the same.
yeah, okay, but it's still in terms of okay, fair enough. So that, if I may say so, is a very strong point. So that sort of that initiative is returns to me in the form of taxable deduction of tax
Yes,
deductible
for a
donations.
top
No,
rate
that's a re
taxpayer, it's half returned to you. It's not entirely returned to you.
yeah, it's half returned. But that's no, that's that I hadn't thought of that. I think that's really helpful. Thank you. Right.
May I just
Moving
plug in,
us
pick up on
on,
something, Daniel, which you
yeah,
mentioned, and you were, I think, leaning more towards the
yeah.
spiritual side of this, idea of tzedakah and not wanting choices taken away. Is that, part of the larger framework of what, say, the Jewish system is trying to encourage in the development of human characteristics, that there is this desire to do that. However, in
Well, that
if I can say real world scenario, I mean, you're talking specifically about how UK taxation, that is likely
yeah.
in practice, or is that likely in practice to fall somewhat short?
So, well, yes, and Dan made that point in relation to sort of the spread of philanthropy in America, that there are inevitably going to be
Right.
bias-driven gaps in it, and I completely accept that. And again, it was Dan who first mentioned tithes. That wasn't me.
Mm.
That was Dan, and they rather improve your point, Elkan, because tithes were minimal. In Jewish law, the bedek haboyes, the amount that you give to service the temple, is minimal and has to be justified by spending estimates each year. It's like the estimates in the Commons, which we mentioned before, and the machzis hashekel, the half shekel, that where it says hadal lo yamit ve'oshir lo yarba, rich people can't give more and poor people can't give less. That again, that's absolutely minimal, and that's the essence there is everybody has to contribute and feel that they're equal contributors. And I think there is an ethical component there that Dan might like to comment on before we move on very fast. Next thing, which is based on what you say, Elkan, it's if I'm a billionaire and I give £1 billion from time to time, or £1 million to a hospital, I am contributing to society. If I am a minimum wage worker and I pay my tax that is demanded of me, I am also contributing to society to the same extent. My machzis hashekel, my half shekel, is the same in ethical terms of contributing to society. Would you accept that, Dan?
I would, but I'd be careful about assuming that modern tax is a mess of compromises and biblical tax was a
No,
simple,
I
more
accept that.
ethical thing. There's a
No,
lovely, sorry, I looked at this preparing for today, so I'm going to talk about it, even though it's not a direct answer to your question. Um, there's a beautiful passage in Maimonides, which anyone who complains about the complexity of modern tax should be forced to read, talking about when it is that you reach the phase of tithing and when it is that you have to tithe. So it's Massa chapter 3. So once you've taken the thing, detached it from the earth, then it's forbidden to eat it, even as a snack, without tithing. But it's okay to snack of it on your way between the place where you pluck the fig and your home. So I imagine people gorging themselves on figs on their way home to avoid the tax. But then there's an anti-avoidance here. It, what about if you intend to bring it home? What if you start salting it or cooking it on your way home? Layers of exceptions and exceptions to the exceptions. And it's a mess. And in fact, I challenge anyone to read this and think of a worse passage in modern tax law. I think you'll struggle.
well, I can do you better. I can
Go
take
on.
your example and raise it slightly in terms of anti-avoidance, because the issue there that the Rambam does discuss, Maimonides does discuss, and the Talmud discusses at great length, is what happens if you arrange that the anim, the poor people who are entitled to take the gleanings
Hmm.
as you're walking home, they are entitled to it. What happens if you make sure that it's your friends and relations, and indeed, if they're people for whom you are already responsible for their food? And that's a real piece of tax avoidance. I
Yeah.
managed to ensure, because I make sure, and that, by the way, in the Megillah Rus, it was there's some very controversial aspects, the Megillah of Ruth, the Book of Ruth, because of course Boaz says to his relatives, Naomi and Ruth, he says, "Stick close while we're collecting the produce, so you'll get the first gleanings." Now, what's he doing there? Is he assuming responsibility for looking after his relatives, or is he actually trying to make sure that that responsibility for it becomes a tax deducted? Do you see what I'm saying?
Because
It comes off.
it's theirs, not his.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah,
So I totally agree with you.
it's
Tax, and
fascinating
indeed,
that. So it's fascinating that there's anti-avoidance rules. It's also fascinating that this was foreseen by the Rambam, because you see people today who propose rules which don't consider that. There's some people who propose what they call a progressive VAT. So
yeah,
I, earning a lot of money, would pay a higher rate of VAT than
that's right.
Bob, who earns a lot less. To which I think the Rambam would spot there's an obvious problem, which is I'll say, "Hey Bob, could you buy this Ferrari for me, please?"
Yeah,
And
yeah,
suddenly avoid the tax. But
yeah.
that taxpayer response is not foreseen by many people proposing this policy. So the biblical tax is both an example
Yeah,
of complication,
it,
example of anti-avoidance, and an example of policymakers understanding that people respond to incentives.
and this is a nice opportunity for me to mention. We're running very short of time. You'll be relieved to hear, because I certainly don't want us to go over the hour, and we've got three more things I want to cover. But you give me an irresistible opportunity to mention Sir Christopher Jenkins, who was the first parliamentary counsel many years ago, who I worked for actually when I was very junior, and he was the head of the office. And I mention him because he died just a couple of weeks ago, so it's a pleasure to mention his name now. And his wife's father was the first financial secretary to the Treasury in the post-war Labour government. And to her death, she thought that it was morally indefensible even to think about the tax implications of my behaviour. She thought tax planning of any sort, including getting someone to buy something for you, which is what put that into my mind. She thought, what I do is I carry out my business, and then the state, and she was a socialist, she was definitely, for her, tax was a socialist redistributive exercise, will tell me how much it wants, and I have to give it. And any kind of formal calculation she thought was morally indefensible. Let me move us on. Dan, that was all very helpful. Thank you both.
We must
Let
come
me
back
move
to
on.
that, because that's an important view, I think. A wrong view, but an important view.
Look, I mean, I mention it because I think it reminds us of the ethical commitment of politicians in that era, which I don't want to say too much in my present role, but I rather see that as a golden age, in the sense that that is a very that is a very serious moral commitment to political behaviour. Do we have that kind of correlation
I,
today? Well,
I
the
am less
less said
kind.
by me, the better. You can comment. I'm not going to.
I'm less kind. I think it shows a naivety about the complexity of taxation. In a world where tax is fair and rational, then you shouldn't need to think about tax, because the tax result is going to be fair and rational. In a world where you can have big differences caused by small irrelevant things, then anyone is going to think about it. Was there anyone who, taking their figs home from the fields, didn't realise, well, I better have my snack before I step over the threshold of the door? I doubt it very much. Just as there is nobody executing a massive M&A transaction today who doesn't think, hang on, am I accidentally going to trigger an enormous capital gain on this transaction, which doesn't reflect the economics and would be anomalous, but is incredibly
No, I
easy to
accept.
do?
I accept that. Although, of course, I accept that. Although, of course, two things. Firstly, I think naivety can be an ethically praiseworthy approach to life. There can be a deliberate naivety, similarly, which I think hers was. Similarly, of course, the concept which we're now coming to of what is the difference between a sham and a legitimate commercial transaction is very relevant to your
Hmm.
last point, because it's okay to do something that is advantageous in fiscal terms. It is not okay to do something that has no commercial purpose and is solely designed to reduce my tax burden.
Yes, I mean, sham's a dangerous word, because the the cases on shams, snook in particular, suggest that a sham has to be really entirely fictitious. You're signing
Yeah,
documents which you
yeah,
intend to ignore. Um, Artificial might be a better test. That
yes, yes,
there's a
yes,
difference between doing something in a careful way to avoid a tax result which would be anomalous, which I don't think is tax avoidance at all, and doing something which is would be crazy, would be something you'd never do, but for the tax result. And distinguishing
yeah,
between those two cases is sometimes very easy and sometimes
yeah,
very hard. In the 70s,
yeah,
in the heyday of tax avoidance in the UK, so we've just jumped 4,000 years, but in the heyday of UK tax avoidance, there was a firm called Rossminster, and they'd create schemes where you come to them and say, "Hey, I'd like to pay less tax," and they say, "Daniel, no problem at all. Sign these 14 documents. We will sling £100,000 round in a big circle. Don't worry, you don't need to give us £100,000. It's just on paper, and it'll come back to you once you sign the documents. But you will magically create £100,000 of tax relief, which, given the tax rate was 98% at the time, will save you £98,000. All you have to do is pay us fees." And that was an artificial scheme. And until the late 70s, that worked. The
yeah.
courts were enthralled to a dicta from decades previously in the Duke of Westminster case that a taxpayer could do anything within the law to reduce their tax and the courts wouldn't stop it. And over time, that began to change. And today, if you do anything remotely like that, you're going to lose.
Talk to us a little bit more. This is bang within my second topic, and we're now racing ahead. We're now going to move much faster. Talk us through, with that in mind, talk us through a little bit, just a little bit, about the evasion avoidance difference. And again,
Hmm.
these are words that everybody understands sort of what they mean, but actually we can write textbooks and textbooks and textbooks about the difference. Give us, if you would, based on what we've been talking
Hmm.
about fairness, about rule of law, about shared services, the different layers of ethical underpinning that we've been discussing, talk us through the basics of the difference between evasion and avoidance, which I think you've begun
Hmm.
to hint at in what you just said.
In theory, it's easy. In practice, it's difficult. So, in theory, avoidance is our farm worker in Temple Days walks back with figs and scoffs them before he gets home because he doesn't want to pay the tithe on the figs. That is within the rules. There's nothing stopping that. It feels a bit like a loophole. What if he gets a collection of his friends instead of going out for dinner that evening? They gorge themselves on figs on the way home.
On the way home, yeah.
Yeah, that's feeling much more like avoidance. And there's an anti-avoidance.
Much more like evasion.
I don't think that's evasion. I think that's still within the rule. But then there's there's the sort of anti-avoidance in the Ramban that's designed to stop you really creating a meal. So if you begin rubbing them, if you if you
The,
separate the parts of them, if you're preparing them for a dish, then you're taxed. But if you walk right up to that line, you're not. I think that's avoidance. Our hypothetical walking dinner party is avoidance, not evasion. Now, what if instead you smuggle them home in your pockets and just don't pay the tithe? Well, this is evasion. It's obviously evasion. That was deliberate concealment. It's dishonesty. Viewed with modern
yeah.
spectacles, that's a criminal offence.
Well, that's what I
Well,
was going to say. I'm sorry, Dan. You know infinitely more than I do about this. But to me, that's not evasion. That's just theft, or that's just stealing from the state.
but that's what
Evasion,
evasion is. That's absolutely what evasion is. The common law offence, one of the few remaining common law offence, that and murder, is cheating the revenue. You are stealing from the state.
yes,
And much like theft, the key element is dishonesty.
yes. But your tax schemes, and I wrote some law about these at one stage in one of the finance bills that I did.
Hmm.
Your tax schemes, they're not theft. They're not the old offence of cheating the revenue. That's the whole point of them.
Hmm.
They're designed not to be. but they're not. We don't regard them as avoidance. We prohibit them not in a criminal way, but we prohibit them on grounds of evasion. So there is some gap between this sort of stealing from the state and legitimately eating the produce on your way home, isn't there?
It's difficult. So let's say that Mr. Greenberg, decide that you found a loophole in council tax, and
Yeah,
if you paint your front door pink, there's no council tax.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
you think that if you read the legislation extremely carefully, you think you found this loophole. You then sell it to thousands of people, and they all paint their doors pink, and they don't pay council tax. Now, were they guilty of tax? And obviously, spoiler alert, there is no such loophole. Were they guilty of tax evasion? Well, they believed you. They may have been stupid, but unless the state can prove they were dishonest, they have not committed a criminal offence. What about you?
It's a criminal offence, but I'm not sure why you're tying criminal offences and evasion solely together with tax
Because they are.
scheme. But
They
with
are.
tax, but Dan, with tax schemes and the duty of advisors to declare and get them tested and so on, that's about a legitimacy of dealing. It's not solely about criminal theft from the state, is it?
Well, but that's where you get the nuance. So you who sold the scheme, maybe HMRC will say, of course, Mr. Greenberg knew that this loophole didn't exist, but
Yeah,
maybe you can convince them that you genuinely thought that, in which case they cannot do you for evasion. Now, you were selling a tax scheme. There's rules requiring disclosure of tax schemes, not for council tax, but let's pretend there is. You never disclose the scheme to HMRC. You broke the civil law, but there is no criminal offence that you committed. So it was a tax scheme that didn't work. It was not compliant. It wasn't really avoidance because it never worked. You could call it failed avoidance or attempted avoidance. So
yeah,
it's somewhere in a strange hinterland
yeah,
where you've broken the civil law really badly, uh,
yeah.
but it can't be proved you've committed a criminal offence. And most of the tax avoidance you see these days, if anyone goes on TikTok and looks for sort of trusts over their house or looks for sort of business rates avoidance, you'll see all kinds of weird schemes. None of them work, but it's very hard to prove that they're criminal
Yeah,
unless you can
yeah,
read the minds of the promoters.
yeah. I mean, it takes us back a bit to where you started at one point, one of your answers, because it's interesting, isn't it, that the state is basically saying tax avoidance or tax evasion is theft. That's certainly the way you're casting it now. And of course, a lot of taxpayers say, "Well, hold on, tax is theft." As you said, at the beginning, you said some people say, if I come and steal a book off your shelf, nobody who isn't an ultimate communist would deny that I have done something wrong in societal terms, and most people would say in ethical terms, by stealing some of your property. There are people who would argue that the state cannot say that of me when it says that I've hidden money that it wanted to take off me in tax.
And that's particularly so if people regard a tax rule as unfair or oppressive. So
Right.
it's not a coincidence that you saw many more people using avoidance schemes in the 70s because tax rates hit 98%, I think higher in some cases.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you don't have to be a radical libertarian to say, actually, I think it is immoral to demand 98%
Good.
of my earnings. So it is moral for me to try and avoid that.
Very good. Very good. And that's a nice bridge to our third block. Thank you very much, because I wanted to take us into our third block by pointing out there are Talmudic references to cheating tax. And those are references to discriminate, not just unfair on everybody, but they are discriminatory, arbitrary taxes. So taxes imposed on Jews, on black people, on
Hmm.
homosexual people, taxes imposed as punitive measures on particular classes of society, in moral terms, have been identified for literally centuries as permissible to evade, avoid, to get away, because they are seen as immoral in themselves. Now, that brings me to my third and uncomfortable part of this discussion, because I think there are two reasons why, unhappily, large parts of religious communities, and let's speak for ourselves, large parts of Orthodox religious communities, or Orthodox Jewish communities, have
Ultra
been
Orthodox,
associated.
not modern Orthodox.
Um, well, I wish that was necessarily. I would quite like it if that were necessarily the case, Dan. I'm not sure that it is actually.
Mm.
Um, but it has been uncomfortably associated with tax avoidance, tax evasion, and tax theft, straightforward theft, but also, of course, benefit manipulation. And what I would like to suggest is two things. You sometimes hear people say, "Oh, that's because there are Talmudic passages about avoiding Jew taxes, and they just haven't noticed that the world's moved on and that these aren't Jew taxes." And I think that's just rubbish. I think that's complete nonsense. I think they're not, people are perfectly well aware that there are no Cossacks coming and pinching my money. I actually think it's much more deeply ingrained in that, in an ethical problem, which is that religion comes with an inherent danger of a feeling of superiority. It's an ineluctable temptation of a religious person to feel spiritually superior to other people, and then that starts me feeling that rules that apply to them don't necessarily apply to me in the same way. Now, it may be that you don't want to comment on this, Dan, from your perspective. I wanted to inject it into our discussion because, for me, as an Orthodox Jew, it's a really important ethical issue to confront the uncomfortable associations with parts of the Jewish community with failing to be honest about their taxes. But I put it to you on that basis, and it will, I hope, if nothing else, lead us into where I want to finish our discussion. But I put it to you for any comment that you or indeed Elkan wants to make on that basis.
Yes, I mean, it is absolutely the case that there is systemic tax evasion in in particular small religious communities,
Yeah.
um, Jewish and Muslim, and indeed not so well known, but some of the is cultish unfair. I don't know what the technical term is, but some small cultish Christian communities too. I think the practical reason for it is simply that if you have a norm that women don't go out and work and men study Torah, then you have a need for money. And that need drives the benefit forward and drives the evasion. Oh, you're not sure you agree?
I think that's a second stage. I think if you're thinking straight, you never get into that. I think that's when you. I think that's almost a justificatory exercise.
I assume the justification followed the need, but I guess it could be
Yeah,
either way
and I
around.
don't think I think it. I do think it's the other way around. I think that, but not look. Neither of us know. Neither of us know,
But we should be
and I
clear.
think
There are plenty of cases in tax law where you do have unfair results and where particular sectors
yeah,
or areas are
yeah,
taxed more than others.
yeah.
So for example, pity the bankers. Banks are taxed a lot. Landlords are taxed a lot more than other economically not dissimilar activities. So it's not clear why a landlord should pay more tax than someone receiving dividends, but they are. So,
Yeah, yeah,
on
yeah.
the
No,
other hand,
I
small
accept.
religious community is not taxed in an unfair way. There isn't an obvious ethical reason
That's right.
why they
I
should not be
accept that.
paying tax.
I very much accept that, Dan. And for me, where that brings me back, and then we'll move on, if we may, to the last question I want to ask you. That brings me back to the idea of taxation and the aspect of it being sort of an enforced charitable behaviour or not. Um, I think what we can agree, hope what I would suggest is that ultimately, and Jewish aphorisms are replete with this. Ultimately, decent relations with the outside world are the fundament of truly spiritual religion. Derech eretz kodem laTorah, decent behavior comes before Torah. The first question a person is asked, according to the Talmud, when they get to heaven, the first person goes is nosos be'emunah. Before you're asked, did you keep Shabbos? The question is, did you deal honestly and truly? And I think we can all agree that proper fiscal behavior requires you to start by approaching society in a straight way, even if you then have serious difficulties with some of the things demanded of you, and that may drive your approach to avoidance, back to the extreme of Christopher Jenkins' father-in-law, who thought it was all wrong, or to a more modern approach, commercial approach. No, I'm allowed to order my tax, but you have to start by looking at the world straight. And anything that starts off, well, I'm special, I'm different, that is going to start as crooked, and crooked will always get us going wrong.
Because everyone is special and different in the end.
Exactly, and that's the reason why I didn't love your idea about the sort of, well, because we learn and they go to work. It troubles me because it's starting to argue that people have got some sort of special lifestyle-based justification. During COVID, there was all, well, of course they're going to keep the yeshivas open because it's more important to them than for other people, and I really hated that, and I wrote very strongly about that. That is just a crooked way of looking at the world. But Dan, in the last 2 minutes, and I've been absolutely fascinated. And the reason we've gone much slower than I wanted to is because you've been predictably fascinating and indeed I haven't had a chance to pick a lot of what you've said as much as I would have liked to. In the last 2 minutes, how much of your motivation for the work that you do? I accept you deny that it's activism, and that's absolutely fine.
It
But
kind
it's
of is.
certainly
It's a
been
kind of
very powerful.
centrist activism, I guess.
But it's certainly been very influential and very powerful. And if I may say so, it has had a very strong ethical impact, even if it didn't have an ethical motive. But this is the question I want to ask you. In exposing the wrongdoing that you have done, in many ways, and in protecting people from the effects of wrongdoing, do you regard that as an ethical activity?
It's probably more instinctive than ethical. When I see people making lots of money out of fleecing their own clients and selling stuff which I know is bunkum, I'm just furious. And I think this is outrageous. And I've been, through really sheer luck, been gifted a platform that lets me do something about it with a lot of help from many other brilliant advisors. So the the idea that it was an ethical position, I think, is something I didn't entertain. It was instinctive. And I think many people,
Well,
there's a, have you seen the cartoon of some guy at a desk with a computer shouting out to his wife, "I can't go to bed, darling. Someone on the internet said something that's wrong." And that's a significant part of the motivation. It's seeing something being said about tax, which is really
yeah.
wrong and harmful. And I'm lucky I can do something about it, maybe. So I
Well,
feel an obligation to do something about it. Is that ego? Is that ethics? I'll leave that to others to decide.
Well, you used a word, and you've given me a brilliant ending for this, Dan. That brings into sharp relief the purpose of the Jewish Ethics Project. You used the word instinct. You said it was instinctive, and to me, as a Jewish ethicist, the Tselem Elokim, the divine image, means instinct. What we have, human instinct, for me, is what it means that we're created in the image of God. And when I see somebody like you, who, if you'll permit me to say so, without religious pretensions, attributes to instinct what the rest of us see as societally beneficial ethical activity, you're rather proving our point that if we can just be good humans, if we can liberate and deploy the Tselem Elohim, the divinity in humanity, then we are building an ethical world without it being some kind of sort of ostentatious, oh, look at me, I'm so religious. And the fact that you're motivated by what you see as instinctive humanity is, for me, validating of the concept that humanity has to underpin spirituality.
That is wonderful, but I love it. I'd love to adopt it, but I feel I'm more driven by instinctive annoyance than instinctive humanity. Maybe it takes us to the same place.
But that's absolutely the same thing. The idea, look, Abraham rowing with God. Abraham probably thought he was quite an argumentative person, but we see him as a profoundly spiritual in being capable of challenging God. I could go on forever, and I've really loved this, and I'm very, very grateful to Elkan, as always, and Jasmina for organising this, and Elkan for overseeing the podcast series. And I'm so grateful to you, Dan. It's been profoundly stimulating. I don't think we've tried to formulate rules or principles, but I think we've raised a lot of ideas that I have found stimulating. I hope viewers find stimulating. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to all our viewers, and I hope everybody enjoys this.